My name is Paul Sutcliffe. I'm Executive Director and founder of Evora, and delighted to host a panel discussion about incorporating sustainability into investment decision making. As you can see, that we've got the title up there. I'm equally delighted to be joined by Natalie Sinha from UBS, Hannah Brown from Heinz, and Emma Williamson from M&G. But rather than me butcher introductions, what I'm going to do is ask each of you to introduce yourself, your role, your organisation, and so on. So, Natalie, as you're next to me, would you like to start, please?
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Sinha. I work at UBS Asset Management in their infrastructure private markets business as the head of sustainability. And I used to work at Evora as well, so I'm very happy to be invited back as an Evora alumni.
Hi, everyone. I'm Hannah Brown. I work at Heinz. Hopefully you're familiar with Heinz, but maybe if not, it's a privately owned investment manager and developer operating across asset types. And then personally, I'm responsible for ESG at a number of our European flagship funds, so our Value Add Fund series and our Core Plus Fund. I also had a background in consultancy, and I worked in Longevity Partners before moving to Heinz.
Hi, I am Emma Williamson. Laura introduced M&G earlier today, but as she said, we have an asset book of approximately 40 billion GAV. I'm the net zero investment lead for the real estate business, so I oversee our climate transition program and ensuring that we balance sort of both our targets and our finances as we move towards that 2050 goal.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, the reason I've brought my clunky laptop up to the front is because I can see the questions. So if you do have questions on the Slido, please use Slido and put them through. We'll certainly pick some of those up. But I do have a series of starter questions, something we prepared earlier. So Natalie, you've got experience across infrastructure, real estate as well from the past. But from an infrastructure perspective, how do you go about standardising ESG and considering ESG across such a varied asset class?
Yeah, sure. So in some ways, real estate and infrastructure are quite different, but in other ways, they are quite similar. So at UBS, in our infrastructure business, we've got fund level sustainability commitments in equity and debt. And we've got diversified infrastructure funds that invest in all types of different infrastructure subsectors. So we've got energy storage, renewables, non-renewables, data centres, fibre, transport, water and utilities, pretty much everything you think of, we've got it. And what's material for a data centre is very different to what's material for transport or energy storage. And so it's all about thinking about what is financially material for that subsector. And in terms of standardisation, the things that are similar throughout the infrastructure sector are that we need the same data from everyone. Mm-hmm. So if we have Article 8 or Article 9 funds, which we do have, we have to request the same data. So things around carbon footprint, energy, health and safety, waste, governance, gender diversity, that sort of thing. And then we also want everyone to be thinking about sustainability and getting excited by it. And ultimately, what it's all about is having the right data, having people excited about sustainability, getting behind it, understanding why it adds value, and also having some objectives and targets around sustainability. And in my view, I think that the fundamental principles of good sustainability management are the same everywhere. Yeah. And my personal favourite is ISO 14001. I think it's a great way to think about sustainability. And yeah, I guess like within infrastructure, the diversity of subsectors is challenging, but it also is what makes it fun.
Okay, thank you. And Hannah, interested to hear about Heinz, slightly different organisation from privately owned. How do you go about addressing ESG, about sustainability?
I think it's a big question. Yeah. So I think if I focus in maybe on one area, yep. Because otherwise I could talk forever. But if we look at maybe sort of acquisitions and how we're making, investment decisions, yep. I think for us, our key sort of focus is to incorporate sustainability from the earliest moment in that decision-making process, and also to standardize our approach and the KPIs that we're sort of including in that process. So we have a sort of a proprietary toolkit that we call it, and it includes things like an ESG due diligence scoping document. So it allows the teams to go out and procure consistent due diligence reports, for example, and covering the same environmental, social topics, but also doing a deep dive into carbon on every acquisition. So we're always requiring sort of historical consumption data prior to acquisition so that we can run our assets against GRESB. And, really important for us to understand if these assets are going to be able to be compliant with our firm level targets of 2040, but we also have fund level targets, which can be more ambitious. So that's super important. And we look at it the same for developments, even forward purchases and forward funding. So the only difference really is that we have a development brief that we'll do a very detailed sort of review against. But that all feeds into that IC process. And we updated that last year to include a variety of, quantitative KPIs. And that's been really helpful for us in challenging the teams and getting them to underwrite deals correctly.
Yeah. Have you ever kicked a deal out in the IC?
Honestly, we're trying to do it from the earliest possible point.
Yeah.
So we've definitely sort of not progressed with deals that we've just decided will not comply. It'll be too costly to get them to that point potentially. But normally, once we've made it through the first sort of review, we're looking at reasons to like improve the deal, rather than necessarily sort of police them.
So it's about the value add as well as the risk. So you manage the risk, but look for the value opportunity.
Exactly.
Well. Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Emma. Net zero carbon. We've heard about it already quite a bit, but how do you embed net zero carbon, especially within the investment decision making process so early?
Yeah, it's a really good and really important question. We think about net zero as a life cycle process. We have quite literally a clock of the life cycle of an asset from buying to selling, and we have different touch points around the clock where we have specific net zero issues that we're addressing. But I think First of all, buying the asset, we get certain net zero audits done as part of the acquisition process so that we understand what we're buying. And where we do have climate transition costs, we make sure those incremental costs, because they are incremental, they're not absolute costs, are included as part of any refurb underwriting that we do. Once we've bought the asset, we then look to manage it through its life cycle. For us, a key aspect of that is, again, those net zero audits. So understanding, particularly in our standing portfolio, because we do have a really big standing portfolio where you are at any given point in time. And having those audits done has been a really good driver for us in that we've really started to really respect the data that we have. We've invested in data scraping and sub-metering and really rounded out our data coverage of our portfolio, which is really a huge advantage. And the other thing it has done having those audits is we've started to embed, I think, the low-hanging fruit as part of our BAU with asset planning. So replacing lighting with LEDs where appropriate, having BMS optimization done, that kind of thing. That kind of stuff has become sort of our bread and butter. And then sort of moving on to, I guess, the last part of the cycle, potentially selling the asset. We use an asset scorecard approach, and that's a bundle of factors, not just ESG, but everything across the financial risk spectrum as well.
Yep.
And ESG is a factor in the bundle of risk factors that then may lead to a sell decision. It's not a sell decision by itself, but it will be part of that weighting.
I mean, that was going to be my next question. It's across. It's linked to the next question. This is for the whole of the panel. But how do we as an industry balance the relatively short term? And I know different organisations have different hold periods, but the relatively short term investment cycles within real estate against longer term climate risk. How do we drive things forward for your own organisation, for value creation, for the investors, whilst recognising that in the long term we've got quite a lot of work to do?
Yeah, sure. So I can go first then.
Thank you.
Well, firstly, I think that the investment time horizon, as you alluded to, is not necessarily short term.
Yep.
So for our infrastructure funds, we've got typically it's between 5 to 10 years, but it can be up to 20 years hold period. And I think climate change is often described as like a long-term problem, but actually it's here and now. You only have to look outside and look at the news every day to see what's happening. The transition's been here for a very long time, and there's just crazy weather events happening all across the world, right? So, you Google storms, look on the news, and there's storms in the Philippines, India, the US, in Europe. And in the summer, we've got extreme heat and prolonged hot weather. And then there's everything else you can think of. So floods, lightning, changing wind patterns, extreme cold, you name it. There's a crazy event happening somewhere in the world. And what we're seeing is that it's a very real thing, and it's here hitting us now in our portfolio. So I've got a couple of examples from our portfolio. So one of them is in the US, a wind farm. And we've seen that the insurance premiums have doubled in a very short time period, in like 1 to 2 years. And then there's another example in our portfolio of a biogas asset in Europe where there was extreme heat. One of the River Po dried up and there was just no water. So there was like a huge issue in the area with water management. All the farmers were trying to work out, what do we do? So that had a huge impact on the agricultural feedstock, and the cost of the feedstock doubled for a period of 2 years. But then I find it quite interesting when I go to some of my investment teams. I'm like, guys, climate risk is a thing. When you think about it, let's put it in the IC papers. And so do that. And then the analysis I find quite surprising when it comes back, because last year, basically most of the team that we sort of trialed this on came to me and said that they actually think the valuation impact is financially immaterial for the majority of our assets, which I thought was fascinating. And I think what it's really underscoring is that I think we're completely underestimating the valuation impact. And we really need to be thinking about resilience in more detail and building it into the investment cases.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. I think definitely seen tensions, I think, from managing those short-term risks and also our longer-term sustainability goals. I think I'm maybe in a lucky position. I definitely think the sort of general consensus at Heinz is that it definitely isn't a nice to have in the short term either. So, we're really looking at not waiting at all. We're trying to get started. I don't think we're under the impression that we're going to have net zero carbon assets tomorrow. That's just not realistic. But we can look to remain, under a decarbonisation benchmark, for example, and that really mitigates our risk and also gets a lot of buy-in, I think, from the teams. And I think something as well, we've always been looking, I think, at very much the impact rather than, I guess, the financial materiality of some of these decisions. And at Heinz, we've just gone through a big process to try and focus in, I suppose, on the areas where we can drive impact, but also, increase our financial sort of returns. And that's been really helpful, I think, to discuss that with our teams and build that sort of defensibility around actioning some of these things now, even considering the market conditions. So that's been something that we've been very focused on.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that planning point is really key. We've obviously been in a really capital constrained environment over the last couple of years. Deal volumes have been very, very low. And so we've actually taken that opportunity to do a lot of long-term planning. I mentioned the net zero audit program, but also, real estate is, even if you want to, you can't necessarily go and make a building net zero tomorrow, even if you've got all the capital available to you, because there's lease events to take into account, there's refurbishments to take into account. So for us, it's really looking across the longer term lifespan of our assets and going, I have an event in X years, therefore I will do A, B, and C at that point in time, and making sure that's documented as well, and making sure through personnel changes, someone understands that when we go to refurbish or relet or whatever it may be, that is the plan for that given asset before we sell it. And so for us, sort of really inculcating that culture is very key, that this is, we need to plan for the long term, not just what we'll do next year. And
so talking about long term, we've talked about net zero carbon, we talked about physical climate risk perhaps, and climate risk, which is, as Natalie's highlighted, an issue now, not necessarily one for many years to come. And it will be one for many years to come, but it's relevant now. But what other trends do we need to think about, especially when we're making investment decisions? What concepts, what issues, what do we need to, as an industry, what do we need to be thinking about?
Sure. So I think that energy costs and the energy transition is going to become quite key. Clearly, you've had a really big uptick in energy costs since the Ukraine invasion. And what that has actually done for us is seen a much bigger dialogue open between us and our tenants about sort of how they can manage their energy costs and how we may be able to help as a landlord. And that's really, really good, because that's opening that energy consumption conversation where perhaps we haven't had that conversation in the past because costs have been a bit more immaterial to the overall business cost. So that's really, really good. And I think, definitely will help drive us towards using more renewables, installing them on site where possible, and managing, that climate transition together with our tenants, which is the ultimate goal. The flip side to that is, I think that grids are really congested in most European markets at the moment, and certainly the availability of grid connections has definitely had an influence on how we underwrite some of our on-site renewable projects. So I think, as an industry, we need to keep the pressure on our respective governments to keep expanding that grid and keep those grid connections open to people who want to connect to them, because it's going to be very difficult to deliver this climate transition without that grid capacity.
Thank you. Anna?
Maybe, yeah. I mean, I think something that we've been looking at, which I don't know if I'd love to know later if this is something that other people are looking at or not, but at Hines, we've really been looking at how our real estate assets are sort of connecting with local infrastructure. And, I think we've seen huge amounts of planning requirements to connect to these district energy systems, especially while these governments are looking to decarbonize themselves. And we've realized quite quickly, I guess, that district energy systems aren't created equal. We have a variety of energy inputs, and we've seen that countries across Europe have really designated different fuel inputs as renewable or not. And for us, I think we really wanted to look at it in a consistent way. So we kind of created our own district energy decision-making guidance, and essentially assigned each energy input an emissions factor so that we can calculate our own carbon intensity when it comes to these district energy systems. And that's something we incorporate in acquisition, but also for our sort of standing assets as well. And if we find that, we don't agree with how they're sort of defining that intensity of that network, then we will underwrite essentially to electrify. So I think it's quite controversial. And essentially, we've decided and taken the view at Hines that biomass, heat from waste incineration, is not renewable, as it's inherently sort of higher carbon than other renewables like wind and solar. But I think that is definitely not agreed upon in many other countries. And yeah, we'd love to hear, I guess, from other people later if that's something you're looking at or not.
Absolutely. And so two positives there from a sense that looking at energy and improving the engagement with tenants is really positive, and then looking beyond the boundaries of a building into how assets interact with the wider community, how we can collectively address those issues, because buildings don't operate in silos; they're connected. But Natalie, what about what from your perspective? What do we need to consider?
Yeah. So if you work in infrastructure, you'll know that there's an infrastructure classic, which is the 4 Ds. So decarbonisation, digitalisation, deglobalisation, and demographic change. And we see these trends are basically driving a lot of infrastructure investments, especially decarbonisation, as the panels touch on. And we think that the long-term secular trends are not going to change based on short-term market volatility. So we see very attractive opportunities in energy storage. Renewables continue to be attractive, but the returns are declining in traditional renewables. And transport as well, because transport is a huge area that is about a quarter of global emissions and represents quite an exciting investment opportunity. And the annual investment gap, I'm sure you're aware, is massive. There's like $3 trillion a year USD investment gap every year from now to 2050 to make sure that we are able to achieve our net zero goals. There's a long way to go. And also, a lot of emissions are still in hard-to-abate industries. So industrials, transport, buildings, agriculture. So those sectors are quite important to think about. But in general, we find that the policy signals are broadly supportive. So, for example, the US Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, the EU's Green Deal, and Fit for 55 package. And then there's loads of sustainability reporting regulation, of course. So the CSRD is a big one, And that basically introduces the concept of double materiality. And you have to have quite a thorough sustainability approach, looking at your impacts, risks, and opportunities. And that's hitting big EU companies quite soon and will probably have quite wide-ranging consequences too. Then there's the CSDDD, the SFDR review that's going on, the UK's SDR as well. And one other thing that I think is quite interesting is this anti-ESG movement and this sort of sustainability recession that I feel is kind of happening a bit, which is I think that sustainability has kind of become mainstream in a certain way, but also, you know, a couple of years ago, I think was the cool thing. To a certain extent, it's not anymore. AI is like the big thing now. So I think that there is like a little bit of a battle on our hands to make sure people are still thinking about sustainability. In the end, what it comes down to is putting your capital in the right places to have the biggest impact and go where the outcomes are needed.
Okay, so there's a lot to do, basically. So we're at a GRESB event, and this next question links to a couple of questions that I've got on the Slido app as well. There's a lot of reporting. Natalie, you've just highlighted more reporting and disclosures that we need to do. And so how do benchmarks and reporting, particularly ones like the GRESB programme, influence your decision making? There's two parts to this question. And what do you want to see change? Who'd like to go first?
I don't mind going first.
Go on.
Well, in general, I would say that there's just too much reporting. There's too much reporting. It distracts sustainability professionals from doing what they want to do, what they came into the profession to do, which is to make a change. And there's just too much regulation. That is confusing. It confuses everyone. It confuses me sometimes, and it's stifling innovation. And I also think that it just doesn't really help the cause, to be honest. And on GRESB specifically, I've been doing GRESB now for 5 years, GRESB infrastructure. And just a disclaimer that these views are my own. They don't represent the views of everyone at UBS Asset Management as a whole. So I would like to say that I think GRESB has had a bit of a car crash of a year. They're in the middle of a PR nightmare. And I've thought at length about how to kind of, how to explain how I feel. So I think that the resource and cost benefit of GRESB doesn't necessarily stack up anymore. The direct and indirect costs that we have are quite substantial. It takes up 3 to 4 months of the year every year, which is a lot of time. And also there's guaranteed mistakes almost every year. In real estate this year, there were some errors and miscommunications that happened that I honestly think are slightly inexcusable. The methodology is opaque, is not transparent, and is very complex. And people don't understand the scores. And I think that the infrastructure, I ask myself, what is it really measuring when, aviation and gas assets are getting some of the highest scores in the whole scheme? And I have some examples where I know that some of our assets have all of the policies and everything, but at the same time, they're in the news with scandals happening. Environmental scandals and litigations, and they're getting 5 stars, and then I've got an asset that's getting 2 stars that's a beautiful fiber asset and is doing everything they can. So I think that we really need to see a shift from GRESB, and it has to focus more on sustainability performance, because right now I don't feel that is the case for infrastructure anyway. I think this year GRESB have had a bit of a nightmare. They've damaged their reputation and also caused a lot of emotional damage, to be honest with you, because, the people who are sitting there are suffering. And I think that there's a lot to be done. I think that something has to change and fast. I think we need clear and consistent communications well in advance. We need closer collaboration with market participants. GRESB is moving too slowly and is bureaucratic and incremental, and that's not good enough anymore. So yes, I'd like to see radical change.
Thank you.
Okay.
When we prepared for this panel, we didn't talk about the detail, but I think one of the important things, and this is for the GRESB team as well, is that as an industry we need to drive change. We need to make change happen. And almost all of us in this room are focused on driving sustainability forward. So we've got the same goals in mind. So the concept here is that we need to be open and transparent with everyone to drive and progress this change. Now, I'm going to open it up to the wider room and to Hannah and Emma, but I do want to say that from my personal perspective, I think GRESB has done a fantastic thing in terms of driving the industry forward, but does need to reflect. And it was positive to hear some of the messaging around decarbonisation and net zero carbon. But it's also really important that we hear and listen from the participants who, for 4 months of the year, have to go through this process and it's a big challenge. It's a massive challenge for our consulting team. So I think I just felt it important to highlight that as a point. Hannah.
No, absolutely. I mean, look, I don't totally disagree with a lot of the things said. I mean, maybe on a more positive note from my perspective, I think I completely agree. I think it's massively important to a lot of our stakeholders, and it remains that way. So it has definitely really increased buy-in, I think, on a lot of our initiatives that maybe we wouldn't have if it wasn't so important for us to do well in this benchmark. I think even things like data coverage. I mean, we consistently obtain 100% data coverage, and the reason is the desire to perform well against GRESB, and we use that data for a variety of other reasons, which is super useful from my perspective. I think I would like to see us move towards a more performance-based approach. I totally agree. A little concern, I think it will probably shift a lot of very strong performing people and portfolios in GRESB, and they'll see some significant scoring shifts, but maybe that is just something people have to get over. I don't know. And ultimately, I think there are other issues, I have to say. Like, I'm a little concerned by asking for performance-based approach that will end up maybe using CREM, which is not a perfect tool yet. I mean, I'm still missing asset types, nuances about sort of tenant operations. So that's a little bit of a concern, but I'm sure if we all sort of move forward in the right direction, we could, get on board and actually just start implementation and moving towards a decarbonised portfolio rather than maybe getting distracted by building certifications and only data coverage and things like that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I tend to agree. So I'm relatively new to sustainability. I've spent most of my career as an investor, both indirect and direct. So I've seen GRESB from both sides now, and I think that without GRESB, we would not have the level of sustainability data that we do now, which is hugely to our advantage, and particularly in a role like mine. And I think that, just as you said, GRESB is really, really important to stakeholders. I see it within our business. It captures the attention of our fund managers, of our asset managers, of our investors. It is the benchmark for judging your portfolio sustainability in a way that can be compared against other businesses. I think, what I would like to see, though, is I'd like to see some more alignment of frameworks, particularly at the asset level. It does feel that we go through the motions and pay various certification costs for the purposes of ultimately ticking a box, that there's no discernible sort of climate transition, climate risk, nature protection type outcome directly as a result of having that certification done. And so I'd like to see some more alignment and basically let that basic principle that the money that we spend, because it is really precious, the money that we spend on ESG, it's that something else doesn't get spent on if we do that. That we are very much just working towards these goals rather than ticking boxes.
Thank you. I've got a question about this kind of connects to GRESB and it links to the net zero carbon element. But if you go back 2 or 3 years, the industry was busy setting net zero carbon targets. And a lot of change. In fact, this is a question that we can put on the Slido, and I'll be keen to kind of get your views on this. The wider industries. So there's a poll, hopefully, that we'll be able to set up and show on screen. But so we've got a lot of net zero carbon targets that have been set for 2030, in some cases before, or we can see it up here. The question I have is, are you considering, or have you already changed some of those targets to reflect reality of where we are now?
I can go for it. I mean, maybe just to highlight, I suppose Heinz's target is operational net zero carbon by 2040. It's SBTI aligned, so we're not sort of reliant on offsetting. if I'm honest, it took us about a year to put that sort of in place. We had sort of 3 consultants, so Ramble on the carbon side, SAP on data, and EY on accounting. It took us ages to put that in place, and we wanted to be aspirational but realistic from the get-go. So no, we haven't considered moving it back, and I don't think there's conversations around it currently.
Okay, thank you. Any others?
So within the real estate business, our absolute target is 2050.
Right.
Clearly that's not going to be moved back. And operationally, we have a soft target of 2040, which I'm hopeful that we'll achieve. I think from a PLC level, we've seen some adjustments in our approach, particularly sort of our business operations, because clearly there's a lot of scope 3 that is probably a lot harder to achieve than perhaps we thought when we set out. Call it 5 years ago with our ultimate targets. And I think, a lot of businesses are in the same boat. Scope 3 is possibly a much bigger challenge than we anticipated.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good point. I mean, we have scope 3, and we've also included originally our third-party managed assets. I mean, that's incredibly difficult to do. So that is something I'm sure that, is something to be reviewed at some point. But currently we're going hell for leather on it.
And Natalie, also, are you?
Net zero targets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've been looking at net zero for quite a few years now for infrastructure. It's actually quite hard, so I've kind of held off on setting any, but we do have loads of investments in the right direction. So we've got energy storage, which is 100% sustainable investments, Article 9. And then we've got investments in renewable energy. We've got loads of other investments that are helping the transition, and you could argue are net zero aligned, but at a portfolio level it's quite difficult to set net zero targets for infrastructure. We kind of keep an eye out on all the guidance. The IIGCC, the Institutional Investors Group on Climate Change, has some guidance on net zero for infrastructure, but yeah, I think for infrastructure it's a bit more challenging, especially if you have like legacy assets that are some of the funds we've got were there since like 2000 or 2007, and it wasn't in the investment strategy that they were going to be net zero. So it is quite complex for infrastructure, but we're always keeping an eye out to see if it's something we can think about doing.
Thank you. It's really interesting because if we look on the responses from around the room from the Slido, a third have. I thought it'd be quite helpful if it's on here. The reason we're leaning back is it's not on the screen you can see here. But a third have got are changing, 13% considering, and less than a third, 31%. No, we're committed and we're sticking to that target. I think there's a reason I asked that, and it's because of the challenge that we face as an industry. So we've got so much to do. We've got a lot to do, and the change makers, the people who can make that change, are in this room today, and in the various other GRESB initiatives and programs and presentations that you've got around the world. So we need to look at managing risk as an industry. We need to look at protecting value and supporting the reputation of the organisations that are managing these assets. And I think what I've heard in this panel discussion is that reporting is really important, but we need to balance that reporting from an effort perspective. And this is GRESB, but not just GRESB. It's the broader reporting, the regulatory reporting, to enable and free up the industry. And the people within the industry that can drive change and make change. So that would be my kind of takeaway from this session. Is that's the angle and the area that we need to go to. So I have been asking the questions as we've gone along, and I've been monitoring some of those questions. So I want to thank all of you for very honest, open discussion points, and thank you so much for engaging. Thank you for listening. What I suggest we do is we stay here and then we bring the GRESB team up, and maybe we have a wider Q&A session, if that's okay. Thank you, guys. Cheers. So there are little microphones in the chairs, actually. It's quite amazing how good it is. So if anyone's got any specific questions or wants to raise anything directly, then please do. There's a... let me just check. Hold on. Here we go. So the questions, here we go. So I'm going to fire the questions to you guys.
Go ahead, Paul.
So one of the ones is there a plan for separating GRESB to an extent, I think I know the answer I'm going to ask, for value add funds specifically? For different, let's broaden that to different types of real estate investment.
Okay, so we already have 3 main strategies that are defined in the GRESB assessment when you started assessment as a real estate participant. And one of them is core, one of them is value add, and one of them is opportunistic. So if there's enough groups or participant submissions in that form a benchmark within that value add, opportunistic or core, then that's the peer group that you find yourself in. Unfortunately, we don't always have that granularity per property type and location. So that's the first really simple answer there. The other, which I'm assuming Paul's alluding to, is that the real estate assessment next year will go on its first, not split, but addition of a residential model. So that's the direction GRESB real estate is heading, somewhat following the lead of infrastructure, where we do have a materiality matrix, a materiality tool that kicks out or adds in or different weight scores around materiality for a sector. And we're doing that for residential, because residentials we've identified and got the most feedback from our members as the one property type that really needs addressing, because it's very different to the other commercial property, for instance. But we're not going to stop there. Through next year, we're going to analyse, okay, what are the next 1 or 2 property types that we're going to create separate modules from 2026. So you think hotels, industrial, that's going to come up there as well. And I saw a question actually about, and I'm assuming this is real estate, why does water get scored when we might not use water for? I get asked this all the time from one of our UK participants. They're a self-storage manager, and they tell me every year I flush a toilet once a week. That's the water that we use. It's crazy that we get judged on it for 7% of the score. So that's the aim really, to form this materiality across the different property types.
Okay, thank you. Another question here is which is an interesting one, is there's a lot more. We touched on it as a panel. There's a lot more regulatory reporting and mandatory reporting. How is GRESB recognising this and working towards addressing this? How does GRESB how do GRESB see this coming, and how do you link with this and differentiate, for want of a better word?
Yeah, this is also something we hear quite a lot, both on the real estate and on the infrastructure side. So for those of you on the real estate side who don't know me, I sit in Steve's team. I look after our infrastructure members in EMEA. So I'll take a little bit of an infrastructure perspective, but what I say also really applies to our real estate side of things. So we are 100% monitoring that regulation space, and where possible, where we see that there is something that we as GRESB can offer, we try to work and provide you with products or services that can help you with that. So we have an SFDR product that you can use to do your SFDR reporting, for example. We saw that regulation coming in, and we recognized from a lot of our members that having a GRESB product that could help with that would be useful. So we listened and we created a product, and it's being used, which is really great to see. Now, I think the one thing that, we haven't mentioned any acronyms, but probably for a lot of you, CSRD is the one that you're thinking about and maybe worrying about as well. We've done extensive reviews of the CSRD regulation. We have specialists in our team that are literally trained lawyers looking at this. What we see is that CSRD focuses on quite different things than GRESB does. What GRESB does is we benchmark real assets. This is where we believe we as a company can provide a lot of additional benefits to our members, to the real assets industry. We see that CSRD is focused on wider industrials, on wider metrics. There's a lot of metrics in CSRD, and although you do your own materiality assessment and narrow that down, there's a lot of stuff that does not overlap with GRESB. So we've reviewed that, and we've decided that this is something separate from GRESB. GRESB will not provide a CSRD product. We think our own products are quite different in scope and in approach. We're really keen to provide you with reports that you can use in your day-to-day to identify where opportunities lie in your portfolios, where you're doing well, where you could do better, and also provide you with the tools to do so. And we love to keep hearing feedback on that because we do want to make our reports a lot better. I mean, our colleagues have touched on this a little bit. And that's why we're saying, okay, we're going to focus on our reports. To come back to the reporting burden part, which we're also really cognizant on, this is something where, as Dave mentioned, we're slimming down some of the assessments to make it more straightforward, to reduce the number of data points that you report that are not necessary. As Steve mentioned, we're looking at materiality for real estate in the long term as well, so that we can remove those water data points that, you don't have any flushing toilets, then that's not an issue. And it's something that, we can't change overnight. We can't delete half of the assessments, nor I think we want to. But we do want to make it as sort of specific as possible without losing the ability to properly benchmark across portfolios and across assets. That's always a trade-off. We try to do our best. We work with the foundation. We are instructed by the foundation. And we continue to sort of build on that. And where possible, we provide you with help to do GRESB reporting. We have an amazing member success team, which is expanded again this year. We've got some of the people in the room today. We're trying to provide you with additional service. We work with our lovely partners to make sure that they're keyed into all of the changes, that they can help you as best as possible, so that we as an industry can get those data points in and make use of them and not just report stuff.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Hannah, I've got a question for you. And that's, now that the SBT, and we can expand this out because it'd be interesting to see how GRESB are taking this forward as well. But now that SBTI standard has been released for real estate, is your plan to review and align with the SBTI target, or do you still predominantly use CREM? You mentioned CREM earlier as a methodology.
Those are net zero carbon target. Oh, sorry. Can you still hear me? Our net zero carbon target is aligned with SBTI from the get-go. We've also just set an interim carbon target. So for all three scopes, 42% by 2030, which is also sort of been approved by SBTI. So that was only recently. So we're still remaining aligned with that, but also we use CREM as a tool to look at our asset performance on the whole, to be honest, currently.
Okay. And so my question to GRESB is, the alignment with SBTI, we've got CREM. What are your plans? What are your thinking around the SBTI building standards and so on? Will it focus? Will you continue to talk about net zero very broadly, or recognise these standards more closely?
Well, I can take that pretty generally first. We definitely have a very close relationship with CREM.
Yeah.
That's a big part of GRESB, but it has been since its inauguration, and that's still part of the assessment in terms of the output. And we work very closely with that. We provide our data to CREM. That relationship will continue on for the foreseeable future. With SBTI, I'm not as close to the technical team as some others, but we do. It's always something that's discussed in the product board meetings about how, well, not product board, but just around the general standards and how that's incorporated. And with net zero, of course, that's one of the general focuses for future years too.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to ask one more question because I think we're short on time and we want to get through some of the recognition as well. But could the GRESB portal be expanded to support more regular reporting on an ongoing basis in future to make it easier for submissions? Because I think that we're hearing that as part of the challenge here.
Yes, for sure. We have a regulatory product called the SFDR reporting product, and that is open earlier. That opens this year it opened up in, I think, the end of January, early February, and next year it'll open up again. And the idea behind that is to have all round year reporting where you can go in and out. And that's a bit of a trial basis for what we can do for the full GRESB assessment. It's a little bit more difficult, given that you're looking at that calendar year and you've got to have an endpoint at some time to benchmark. But it's something that we want to do. Katie can talk a bit more about infrastructure because we are doing something different there on the output side next year.
Yes, so we are looking into, especially because a lot of the data that you report into your assessments, it sits in our portal, it comes in on July 1st, and then we take that, we validate it, and we score it. And That process is quite extensive and it takes roughly 2 months. And that's why you get your benchmark reports, the preliminary versions, in September. Now, we also recognize that a lot of our investor members, but also our participant members, want to have access to the raw data much sooner than that. So we are looking into ways where as soon as the sort of reporting closes and you've made your submission, you'll be able to access at least the raw data. Of course, the scores and the validation outcomes wouldn't be present, but we are looking into sort of giving you access to the data set sooner so that you can get going with that and you don't have to wait 3 months, which if it's just the raw data, that, you know, doesn't change anything.
Okay, thank you. I am going to draw the Q&A to an end because I know we want to, because GRESB is clearly a lot of work for a lot of people, the GRESB team, people in this room, and we do want to recognise some of the GRESB results. So thank you very much. There's a whole bunch of questions. We'll circulate those. We'll make sure that the GRESB team have got those as well, and we'll be able to respond. And of course, there'll be the opportunity to talk later on. But thank you very much, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.